The wind outside is screaming like a banshee, tearing across the Wyoming plains at 40 degrees below zero. A cold, brutal enough to snap a pine tree like a twig. But inside this strange, hump-backed cabin, 32-year-old Sarah Miller isn't shivering. She is sitting comfortably in her rocking chair, sipping hot tea, resting her hand against a wall made not of expensive timber, but of raw dirt. To anyone else, it looks like a pile of mud. To Sarah, it feels like life itself, warm, solid, and radiating a steady heat that defies the blizzard raging just inches away. Her 10-year-old daughter, Lily, is sleeping soundly across the room, safe and warm, without even a heavy quilt. 6 months ago, the wealthy neighbors freezing in their mansions down in the valley laughed at Sarah. They said she was digging her own grave. They said a woman couldn't fight nature. They were wrong. She wasn't fighting nature. She was mastering it. But to understand how a cast-off widow with nothing but a knife and a shovel outsmarted the deadliest winter in history, we have to go back to the night the rain washed away her old life. August 1893. The rain didn't just fall. It hammered against the roof of the Miller estate like a judgment. Inside, the air was warm, scented with expensive tobacco and hypocrisy. But Sarah felt a chill that settled deep in her marrow. She stood in the shadow of the hallway, a ghostly figure in her nightdress, pressing her ear against the heavy oak door. "She's dry, Thomas, a barren field." Her mother-in-law's voice was a venomous hiss, cutting through the thunder. 10 years, and only that one scrawny girl to show for it. The herd needs a bull, not another heifer. Sarah held her breath. "Speak up, Thomas," she pleaded silently. "Defend us. The older Sterling boy needs a servant," the old woman continued, her tone shifting to calculating coldness. "They offered a handsome price for Lily, indentured until she's 18. It's enough to buy you a new ring, Thomas. A young wife, one who can give us a jagged line of sons." A heavy silence followed. Then the creak of a leather chair and a soft, "Do what you must, Mama." The betrayal hit Sarah harder than a physical blow. It was absolute and irreversible. Thomas wasn't just weak. He was complicit. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't weep. A steely resolve hardened her features. She moved with predatory silence back to the bedroom. She bypassed her silk dresses and grabbed a rough canvas sack. Into it went a loaf of bread, a flask of water, and the only thing her father had left her, a heavy carbon steel Bowie knife with a staghorn handle. She crept into the nursery. Lily, 10 years old and fragile as a porcelain doll, slept soundly. Sarah shook her gently. "Lily, baby, shoes, now." "Mama, it's storming." "We're playing a game," Sarah lied, her voice unwavering. "A quiet game." They slipped out the back, bypassing the servants' quarters. The wind howled, tearing at their clothes, but the storm outside was merciful compared to the suffocating malice inside the mansion. As they crested the ridge, Sarah looked back. The Miller estate glowed with gaslight, a golden cage she had finally broken. The journey was a treacherous blur of mud and briars. For 3 days, they hitched rides on wagons and walked until their feet bled. They arrived in Silver Creek, Sarah's hometown, under a gray, oppressive sky. But there was no warm welcome. The town doctor, looking haggard, met her at the gate of her parents' homestead. "The fever swept through in July, Sarah," he said, his voice hollow. They're both gone. Buried 'em out back. Sarah stood before the legacy they had left her. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a dilapidated shack, the roof sagging like a broken spine, surrounded by overgrown weeds. She clutched the land deed in one hand and Lily's trembling fingers in the other. No money, no husband, no parents. Just a rotting cabin, a sharp knife, and a ferocious need to survive. September 1893. The Wyoming wind didn't knock, it simply walked right through the walls. Sarah stood in the center of the main room, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The inheritance was a cruel joke. The cabin wasn't a shelter, it was a decrepit skeleton. The chinking between the logs had crumbled away, and the timber itself was punky, soft with rot. A solid kick might bring the whole structure down. She checked the woodpile. A few damp logs. Not enough to last a week, let alone a Wyoming winter. And with empty pockets, she couldn't buy lumber, coal, or labor. We're going to freeze, Mama, Lily whispered, sitting on a crate, hugging her knees. Her voice was small, apprehensive. No, we won't, Sarah lied, though a suffocating dread was tightening her chest. Desperate to find anything edible, Sarah lit a lantern and lifted the trapdoor to the root cellar. She descended the rickety ladder into the dark. The air down here was different. Upstairs, the wind bit with merciless, icy teeth. But down here, surrounded by 6 feet of dirt, it was still. It was temperate. Sarah paused, her hand resting on the cool, damp earthen wall. A memory surfaced, clear as a bell. Her father, his face smeared with coal dust, sitting by a campfire years ago. The wind is a thief, Sarah girl, he had said. But the earth? The earth is a miser. It hoards everything you give it. Heat, cold, water. It's the poor man's eternal blanket. Her eyes widened. The realization was sharp and analytical. The cabin was trying to fight the wind with rotting wood. It was a losing battle, but the earth didn't fight. It absorbed. She grabbed a stick and crouched on the hard-packed dirt floor. She began to draw frenzied lines in the dust. Mama? Lily peered down from the trapdoor, her silhouette framed by the gray light above. Come down here, Lily, Sarah called out, her voice no longer trembling. It was authoritative. When Lily reached the bottom, Sarah pointed to her scratchings. We can't fix the wood, Lily. We don't have the money. So we're going to stop acting like carpenters and start thinking like badgers. Badgers? Lily looked perplexed. We're going to use the dirt. And the rocks, Sarah explained, her mind racing. We'll pile the earth up against the north wall to stop the wind. Then we'll gather the river stones. Big ones. We'll stack them inside, right where the sun hits through the south window. Why rocks? Because rocks are hungry for heat, Sarah said, tapping her temple. They drink the sunlight all day, get hot, and then at night, when the fire goes out, they bleed that heat back into the room. It's a thermal mass. She looked at her daughter. The plan was unconventional, bordering on eccentric for a proper lady. The townspeople would think she had gone mad, digging in the mud like a wild animal. It's going to be hard work, Lily. Back-breaking work. We have to move the earth before the snow flies. Are you with me? Lily looked at the crude drawing, then at her mother's dirt-streaked face. The fear in the girl's eyes slowly receded, replaced by a steadfast trust. She didn't fully understand the science, but she understood the fire in her mother's eyes. "I can carry rocks, Mama," Lily said firmly. Sarah smiled. A genuine, resilient smile for the first time in weeks. They wouldn't just survive the winter. They would outsmart it. October, 1893. The work was not for the faint of heart. It was grueling, relentless labor that stripped away any lingering softness from their former life. Sarah and Lily became creatures of the earth. They dug trenches around the rotting foundation, banking the soil high against the north and west walls. Sarah mixed mud and dry grass with her bare hands, creating a crude adobe to pack into the rotting timber. The sight of Lily was enough to break a heart. 10 years old, her once fine dress reduced to rags, dragging a woven basket of river stones twice her size. Her face was smeared with gray clay, her hands raw and blistered. Yet her eyes held a dogged determination. She didn't complain. She simply worked, driven by the innocent belief that her mother was a magician, turning dirt into warmth. Then came Jonas Thorne. He arrived on a high-stepping bay horse, looking every inch the prosperous landowner in his heavy wool coat and polished boots. Thorne owned the adjacent grazing lands and wore his arrogance like a badge. He watched them for a long moment, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "I've seen desperate things in my time, Mrs. Miller," Thorne called out, his voice dripping with judgmental pity. "But digging your own grave before you're dead, that's a new one. They're calling you the Mud Widow down in town." Sarah didn't stop packing the mud. She slammed a handful of wet clay into a gap between the logs. "It's called thermal mass, Mr. Thorne," she said without looking up. Thorne laughed, a harsh, callous sound. "It's called madness. Look at the girl. She's a scarecrow. If you had any sense, you'd send her to the orphanage or find her a placement as a maid. Better than freezing to death in a pile of mud." The suggestion, so eerily similar to her mother-in-law's cruelty, made Sarah's blood boil. But she remained composed. She stood up, wiping her muddy hands on her apron, and looked him in the eye. "The wind doesn't care about your opinion, and the frost doesn't care about my reputation," Sarah said, her voice level and unflinching. "Physics doesn't lie, Mr. Thorne. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have daylight to burn." Thorne scoffed, shook his head, and spurred his horse away, muttering about stubborn fools. By late November, the transformation was complete. The cabin was no longer a house. It was a grotesque mound of earth, stone, and straw. It looked like a hibernation den for a beast, ugly and misshapen compared to the neat, whitewashed farmhouses in the valley. But as the first heavy snowflakes began to drift down, covering the ugly brown earth in a pristine white sheet, Sarah pulled the heavy, reinforced door shut. The wind howled outside, battering the valley. Inside, the candle didn't even flicker. January 1894. The Great White Hurricane hit Wyoming with apocalyptic fury. The thermometer plunged to 40 below zero, a temperature where breath freezes instantly and hope dies. Outside, Silver Creek was a chaotic white hell. Livestock froze stiff, standing in the fields, solid as statues. At the Thorne estate, the scene was one of desperate luxury. The massive cast-iron stove roared red-hot, devouring cord after cord of wood, yet the frost crept relentlessly up the inside of the glass windows. Jonas Thorne, wrapped in a heavy buffalo fur coat, paced his parlor, his breath visible in the air. His children huddled under mountains of quilts, shivering violently. Their woodpile was nearly gone, and the house was leaking heat like a sieve. Inside the mud widow's hovel, the atmosphere was surreal. The wind screamed like a banshee against the north wall, but the thick earthen berm absorbed the blow without a shudder. Inside, the fire had burned down to mere embers hours ago. Yet, the air was comfortable, balmy even. The massive pile of river stones in the center of the room, having absorbed the stove's heat all day, was now releasing it slowly, like a gentle, invisible radiator. Lily sat at the rough-hewn table, wearing only a light wool sweater, practicing her handwriting. "It's quiet, Mama," Lily murmured, dipping her pen. Suddenly, a heavy thud shook the door. Not the wind, a fist. Sarah unbarred the door. Jonas Thorne stood there, a wretched figure coated in ice, his face gray with hypothermic shock. He had come, perhaps, to offer a grim charity, or perhaps simply to verify that the crazy woman and her child were dead. "Come in, Jonas, before you let the winter in," Sarah said, her voice calm. Thorne stumbled over the threshold, bracing himself for the damp, freezing air of a tomb. The door slammed shut. Thorne froze. He blinked, dumbfounded. He wasn't shivering. He stripped off his frozen gloves and reached out, touching the ugly, mud-packed wall. It wasn't cold. It was warm. The entire house felt like a living thing, holding them in a protective, heated embrace. He looked at Lily, healthy and warm, then at the dying fire, then at Sarah. The arrogant landowner was gone. In his place stood a man humbled by a force he hadn't understood. "How?" he croaked, his voice cracking. "My furnace is roaring, and my water is frozen. You have dirt." "The earth holds what you give it, Jonas," Sarah replied, a subtle triumph in her eyes. "While you were fighting the winter, we invited it to hug us." Thorne slid down the wall to the floor, the undeniable warmth seeping into his frozen bones. He looked at the woman he had mocked, realizing that in this frozen world, she was the only one truly alive. April, 1894. The thaw arrived in Silver Creek not with a whisper, but with the roar of the river breaking its icy chains. Mud, the very substance Jonas Thorne had mocked, was now the town's most discussed commodity. The snow melted to reveal the truth. While the ornate Victorian houses in the valley had suffered cracked pipes and frost-damaged foundations, Sarah's mud monster stood impassive and solid. It had weathered the fiercest winter in Wyoming history without a single crack. Jonas Thorne was the first to arrive, his boots squelching in the driveway. He didn't come on his high horse this time. He walked. He held his hat in his hands, looking penitent and humbled. "Mrs. Miller," Thorne began, clearing his throat awkwardly. "I've got 3 tenant houses that need rebuilding. I was wrong. You weren't digging a grave. You were building a fortress. I'll pay you double the carpenter's rate if you oversee the construction." Sarah didn't gloat. She simply nodded, her expression pragmatic. "I'll do it. But Lily keeps the books, and you pay in gold, not script." By May, the Mud Widow had become the Earth Architect. It was a sight to behold. Rough-hewn ranchers and weathered cowboys standing in a circle, listening intently as Sarah, dressed in simple calico, drew diagrams in the dirt. She taught them about thermal mass, solar orientation, and the resilient power of the Earth. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a visionary leader. The past, however, tried to knock one last time. A sleek carriage arrived from the city. Thomas Miller, Sarah's husband, stepped out. He looked older, softer, and out of place in the rugged landscape. He had heard rumors of Sarah's innovations and perhaps sensed an opportunity to reclaim a useful wife and a daughter he could still sell. "Sarah?" Thomas called out, walking toward the porch with feigned confidence. "I've come to take you home. This dirt pile is no place for a lady." Before Sarah could reach for her knife, a shadow fell over Thomas. Jonas Thorne stepped between them, flanked by 2 other ranchers. "You must be the husband who let his family walk into a storm," Thorne said, his voice low and menacing. "Mrs. Miller is a citizen of Silver Creek, and we protect our own. I suggest you turn that carriage around before the wheels fall off." Thomas looked at the wall of men, then at Sarah. She didn't look down. She looked through him, her eyes steely and indifferent. He was no longer her master. He was just a stranger. He turned and fled, disappearing from their lives forever. That evening, Sarah sat on the porch with Lily. The valley below was turning green. They had no fortune in the bank, but they had respect, a home that kept them safe, and the unbreakable bond of survival. Sarah squeezed Lily's hand. "Remember this, Lily. When the world tries to freeze you out, you don't beg for warmth. You build it." They had proven that a woman's strongest weapon wasn't her tears, but her resourceful mind and her ferocious love. What about you? If you were stranded with nothing but the clothes on your back, what is the one skill you possess that would keep you alive? Tell us in the comments below. If you enjoyed Sarah and Lily's journey from tragedy to triumph, please smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories of survival and human resilience. See you in the next video.